Hello and welcome to the Bodyline Pro podcast. My name is Isaac Osborne, founder and CEO of Bodyline Pro. In this podcast, we interview practitioners who use Bodyline Pro and some of the leading experts in the health industry who are committed to taking a scientific approach to improving the form and function of the body and the growth and development of their practice. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Be sure to check out the show notes for links. For more information about Bodyline Pro, visit bodylinepro.com. Welcome to episode 7 of the Bodyline Pro podcast. In this episode, our guest is David Lesondak, author of Fascia, What It Is and Why It Matters. David is an allied health member in the Department of Family and Community Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where he maintains a clinical practice in structural integration, visceral manipulation, and other fascial modalities at UPMC's Center for Integrative Medicine. He has been doing clinical bodywork for over 25 years, certified in anatomy-trained structural integration by Thomas Myers. He's a Board Certified Structural Integrator, Fascial Fitness Trainer, Visceral Manipulator via the Barral Institute, and certified by Ann and Chris Frederick as a Fascial Stretch Therapist, Level 1. I really enjoyed this podcast with David. He is a great impersonator. He is just hilarious to talk to. Had such a great time talking to him. We talked about fascia in the brain, ground substance of fascia, devices that measure fascia, how fascia becomes restricted, and much, much more. Also, for a limited time, his publisher has been very generous to offer the listeners of the Bodyline Pro podcast and viewers a special discount of 15% off the list price of David's book, Fascia, What It Is and Why It Matters. You can buy it direct from the publisher with the code BODYDL18. The link for that for Handspring Publishing is in the show notes, so follow that link. It'll take you directly to their site to purchase the book, 15% off, and you get free shipping to all U.S. addresses. Now, please note, Bodyline Pro does not make any money off of this. This was strictly from their publisher as a discount to all of you. I am making no money off the sales of this. So please, if you're inspired to buy the book, buy it. I love the book, loved reading it, and I think you'll like it too. So without further ado, here's David as we review his book, Fascia, What It Is and Why It Matters. I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. David, welcome to the show.
Hi, Isaac.
I'm really grateful to have you on the show today. And I have finished reading your book about a month ago or so. Really, really enjoyed your book.
Thank you.
It's quite a piece of work here that you put together.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love just to start out with a very, very simple but maybe profound question.
Okay.
Why did you write this book?
The desire to write this book had been simmering for a long time. I had the privilege of kind of being at the center of a lot of the science, the burgeoning fascial science movement. Of course, which reached a certain apex in 2007 with the first Fascia Research Congress. But a number of years prior to that, I had done dissective work with Tom Myers in trying to see if we could do fascially sparing dissection techniques and actually dissect the anatomy trains out of the body. Some of those worked better than others. I'm sorry about that. Are you hearing that?
Yeah, I do hear it.
I thought this, let me just turn my phone off. I thought I had it on silent. I apologize.
No problem. It's the modern world that we're in.
I know. So, David Answers, take 2. So, why did I write this book? I felt like I was in a unique position. As a clinician, I'm always curious about why things work, why certain approaches, techniques get a certain result, what the mechanisms are behind those results, and by learning about what's going on behind the curtain, so to speak, perhaps actually improve or make my own results more consistent. So I had the unique opportunity to get involved, work with, and sometimes for people like Tom Myers, Robert Schleip, Tom Finley, and in doing so, met Carla Stecco, met Andre Vleeming, and Jean-Claude Guimberteau. And I kind of found myself in the middle of the burgeoning science of fascia. And yet I have to go back home and work with my patients at the hospital and translate some of those ideas into what's going on, when they would say, well, what's really going on? Why is this working? Why did this get a good result? So I found myself getting really good at being able to take the sciencey Y&C bits and explain them in a way that was impactful. And I didn't really see anything out there in the book market that did that. So that said to me that there was a need for a book like this. Mm-hmm. So that's the short answer.
Yeah, and I think that you absolutely nailed it on that.
Thank you.
Because most of the books that I have read on fascia do not cover what you've answered in this book and what you've entailed. I really like how you've brought together, all the research from Guimberteau, from anatomy trains, from Dr. Schleip's work, and much, much more, including the history, how you just, the history was so in depth. I really, really enjoyed that. I learned a lot and really, really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
So
I thought it was good to have context.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of my favorite things to you just mentioned, why is this working? But one of my favorite things is also to understand, why is it not working? Mm-hmm. And I think that what you've said in here helps lead us to find out what's not working or why it's not working. And I tend to like to look at this because then it helps me improve my practice more.
Exactly.
And so I had some questions from the book.
Sure.
There was, and this is on, I don't know if you want to refer to the book or not, but I can tell you the page number.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Highlighted. And it may be just from me not understanding properly.
Okay.
So I don't mind a really easy answer in the sense that layman's terms. And plus, sure. and just for our listeners' sake, there are listeners who have no idea about what we're talking about from a clinical perspective. They're listeners who are not professionals. Mm-hmm. And so we do want to speak to them as well as part of the audience. Okay. So when under, and this is referencing, this is chapter 1 on page 14.
Okay.
And it's representing fibroblasts, mm-hmm. and how they synthesize and remodel. And when under high tension, the fibroblasts will increase collagen production and cell proliferation. And so my question on this was the definition of the high tension. It can be what kind of tension? It can be, is it pulled taut? Is it shortened and compressed? Or is that even definable through this?
Well, I think the best way to think about that is, let's use another semi-obscure term, when it's under load.
Under load.
So I can have a bad ergonomic workstation and have to type like this all day. Now, that's not compression, but it is tension. And if I have 6-7 hours of tension like this a day, mm-hmm. That's going to give the message to the fibroblasts that we need more collagen here to support this. Okay. Now, if I then go home and relax by playing video games on my couch all day long, and I don't actually do any movement to counteract this repetitive motion over a period of months to years, because you approximately about 3/4 of the collagen in your body replenishes itself about once a year. Some of the thicker things take a little bit longer. Some of the thinner things are shorter. But within that year to 18-month time frame, the collagen network can potentially reorganize itself around that repetitive motion to support that repetitive motion. Now, in certain things, like if you're going to go climb Mount Kilimanjaro and you're training for that, that's probably good.
Yeah, absolutely.
But in other instances, it's not so good. So it's about understanding when it's appropriate for the person and when it's not appropriate for the person from a clinical perspective.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, we're talking about the fibroblast here, and that they are laying down more, let's just say, fascia or connective tissue.
Yeah, specifically collagen fibers, which become the pullable component of your fascial matrix.
So it's thickening of that area, and this area becomes thickened because of that load or tension in that area. True?
Correct.
Okay. So from a bodywork standpoint of practitioners, of anybody that is working with fascia, myofascial release, structural integration, et cetera, this is of interest to us because this would be areas that we're affecting while we work. Is this true?
Exactly. So what you can argue about whether or not you can change tissue. And that's an argument that I don't find for myself right now interesting. But what I can say is we can definitely influence the behavior of the fibroblast. So I've got somebody on my table, they get up and suddenly their shoulder's moving better, or they can move at the hip better because I was influencing the area around the obliques and the quadratus lumborum underneath it. And that's setting into process, a natural cellular process that every time they take a step or every time they move with a slightly greater range of motion, continues the treatment long after they've left my room, or potentially continues the treatment long after they've left my room. If I don't work with the person that's seeing me to make them become more aware now that that holding pattern is beginning to change, of how to use it, how to catch themselves when they're going back into the pattern that they don't want. Well, if I don't do that, then their results are not going to be as good as if they continue to use the new flexibility. Use it or lose it is kind of a biological reality in that respect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's something that I found also, unless you have more to say on that,
No.
Go ahead and move on. The telecytes. I didn't know anything about the telecytes until I read your book.
Yeah, I found out about the telecytes just about the time I was about ready to turn the book in. And I said, wait, I've got to add something because we just found out this new thing. So it was really cool to be able to add that into this mix. And they're so brand new, we know very, very little about them, except that they seem to be another way that the body communicates on a cellular level. Could
you briefly explain what telecytes are for our audience?
Okay. Well, it's another type of cell in the fascial network that seems to be solely a messenger. So it lives in the extracellular matrix and it carries chemical messages to different parts of the body. That's about all we know. Though I'm just looking at, and I just pulled up something in the January 2018 issue of Medical Hypothesis, that telecytes can have an influence on the immune system and in the pathogenesis or the development of fibroids in the uterus.
Wow.
And yeah, I just pulled this up the other day, so I haven't even really read it enough to speak to it intelligently other than just that. So beyond that, I don't have details. And that's in the January issue of Medical Hypothesis.
Interesting.
So yeah, so the telecyte is a new player basically, and we don't know much about it yet.
Okay. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch that grow and see more information about. I really liked what you said here. It's the ability of the telecyte to adapt to its environment, changing phenotype according to location. That's really, really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It really, really is. So they're almost I could get cutesy and call them cellular shapeshifters, but that seems to be one of the behaviors that they've noticed about them. Now, what that means, what its clinical relevance is, how it can be manipulated, we don't know yet. But it's certainly an exciting new frontier.
Does that speak to the research of growing organs, for instance, when they grow hearts or certain organs, that they put them in certain shaped dishes that helps the stem cells identify the DNA? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't researched this very thoroughly. It's a couple articles I've read on it, that they place the heart cells in a certain shaped dish, and then that helps it identify what organ it's going to grow into. Do you think that maybe telecytes, I don't know, it was pure speculation.
I'm gonna add, well, the answer is it could be. And I've got to tell you, I'm not familiar with that research. So I want you to send me that when we're up.
Yeah.
Because that is absolutely fascinating and something that I did not know about. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff that I've seen. Excellent.
Yeah, it's good to always remain a student, even after you've written a book. In fact, it's even more important to remain a student after you've written a book.
It's kind of like why you wrote the book, though, right? Is to remain a student. Because dive into all of it, right?
Right. And again, to put it together in a way that was like, oh, I get this now. So I'm hoping that when people read the book, it will give everybody a better working knowledge. But if there's a particular area that fascinates them or that they want to learn more about, they can dive more deeply into the research.
Absolutely.
And then maybe come back and tell me something 2 years later and say, hey, did you see this? And it's like, no, I didn't.
So the next thing I would like to, this is interesting. Actually, this goes all the way back to page 6.
Okay.
And it's the load and creep of fascia.
Okay.
I love that terminology.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of goes back to the first question, I guess, but it's the ability of fascia to slowly deform under load. It's called creep. The load is manageable. The fascia will gradually adapt to it in appropriate ways. This I love. And one of the fun things that I do with clients, everyone's heard of the analogy, you are what you eat. I also love to say your body's shape is from how you move. And
yes.
So the examples I'll give with clients, or if I'm speaking somewhere to people that have no idea about what we do, I'll have them cross their arms. And right now I have my left crossed over my right. And then I'll ask them, okay, now we have that. Now go ahead and reverse that so that your right is clocked. Whatever your natural tendency. It's not so easy. So it messes with your nervous system, one. And two, the discomfort of that has a lot to do with your movement patterns, and the fascia tends to gradually adapt to your body patterning. And I feel that you were speaking to that here in your book. Is there anything that you'd like to say in more depth about that, or how you look at that maybe in your practice?
Well, it depends. Again, I think I alluded to this earlier. You need to think about who this person is and what they do, and take that and what they love to do, and take that into consideration as much as what the apparent reason they're coming to see you is. So I think you were saying earlier, Isaac, about knowing when it isn't working, or I would expand that and say knowing where not to work. So if I'm working with a professional baseball pitcher who's throwing, 90, 100 mile plus fastballs, that's going to have a difference on the relationship between their spine and their shoulder girdle than it would if they were a southpaw, if they were a left-hand baseball pitcher throwing those kinds of things. So there may be visual asymmetries that as a structural integrator, I go like, oh, look at that acromion process, or there's a bend in the spine there. But for that person, that might be completely normal. And if it's not causing a pain or a function issue, leave it alone.
Sure. Unless they, for whatever reason, want to change it.
Right. Exactly. No, and I've seen, and on the other hand, I've seen people with very flattened thoracic curves because of excessively, let's call it static forward bending.
Right.
Years and years. I call it yoga back. No offense to the yoga practitioners who might be listening to this. I'm a regular yoga person myself. That kind of distortion is something that you don't want. So if you put enough stress on it over time, it may adapt to that stress and not creep back.
Right.
The creep is about how you and I can sit here for an hour doing this podcast, and when we get up off the chair, our butt doesn't look like the chair. It kind of goes back to looking like our butt. That's healthy creep.
Thank
maybe
goodness.
That's a thing to say, but let's not go there.
I'm glad that my butt does not look like this chair. It may feel like it, but I'm really glad that it doesn't. So I want to jump to, I'm jumping all over the place.
Yeah, it's great, man.
But muscle spindles. And so just basically, let's start out with maybe a brief overview of fascia and the nervous system, which I was so excited that you wrote about because there is not much on this out there.
No.
At all. And this fascinates me more than anything on how fascia and the nervous system interrelate. So let's geek out on this for some time here.
Sure. Yeah. And the truth is, I'm glad you're excited about it. It's another frontier, the relationship between fascia and the nervous system. And again, if you look at the number of published papers on it in the last 50, 60 years, there aren't many. So again, this is an area where we don't know a lot yet. What we do points us into some very interesting directions. So for example, most of the nerves in the fascia are sensory nerves and not motor nerves. They have more to do with the feel and the quality of things: hot, cold, pleasure, pain. The difference between a fingertip and a fist. All these kinds of distinctions seem to be part and parcel of the sensory nerves that live in the fascial net. There's also a lot of what I call real-time biofeedback going on from these sensory nerves about how we're using our body and we know if we reach a little bit further, we might hurt ourselves, and sometimes we make the decision to do it, and sometimes we go, no, I'm going to back off from that. So that's a byproduct of a healthy functioning sensory nervous system, and also, making an informed critical decision about when to do or not do something. We've all had that. I shouldn't lift that. Oh, why did I do that? We've all had those moments. Absolutely. And if we're listening to our bodies just a little bit better, we can avoid those moments. There was just a recent article published in Germany that did a mathematical formula based on the skin and the number of nerves in the skin, because we can't possibly know how many of these sensory nerves are in the fascial net, but somebody in Germany just did the math and published it somewhere around 100 million. And the way these nerves work,
this is the research that Dr. Schleip just recently came out with, right?
He talked about it. He did not do this piece of research. This was done independently by a mathematician.
Right. Yeah.
He talked about it on your show, didn't he?
Yeah. He the first place that it was announced, actually.
Yes. Because I watched that and I went, I got to find me that. So I went and I found it and I got it translated. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. So awesome. Now I know where to attribute.
So can you talk a little bit more in depth about that?
That it wasn't a very in-depth article. That's pretty much the whole genesis of it was, here's our best estimation of how many of these sensory nerves are out there based on other systems in the body with a similar surface area and mass.
And can you repeat that number again? What was it again?
It was in the neighborhood of 100 million.
100 million.
100 million.
Sensory receptors.
Yes.
And they're in the fascia or the muscle spindle, the fiber?
They're in the fascia. They're in the fascia.
And now
the muscle spindles are in the paramysial coating.
But wait, back to that. So the area, what is the size of that? Like, is that like a square inch, a square millimeter?
Mm-hmm.
Where in the fascia is that 100 million?
Okay, here's they are everywhere. They are throughout the entire universe of the body, which is not a very useful answer, but it's the truth. Now, where a lot of them are in the sliding layers, and we know this from the work of the stuccos. They're in the sliding layers between the muscles. So they're in the fascial. They're, if we think about a bag of fascia over this muscle and a bag of fascia over that muscle, in between is where a lot of those sensory nerves live and hang out. So as things are moving or not moving, they're again giving you that real-time biofeedback.
That's really, really interesting. Did you see Gil Headley's presentation, What's the Fuzz?
I did not. I missed Gil when he was on his tour, and I really, really regret that because I know I missed something really spectacular.
It was amazing, this is actually speaking to what he's talking about. And I'm not going to say more about it because he's actually going to be on the podcast.
Good. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
So, but he's a little cagey about how much he wants to reveal because he's decided to write a book about it.
Okay.
Which I'm really excited for him and excited to have that reference.
Yeah, no, I think it's great that Gil's writing a book.
Yeah, me too.
It's about time.
I'm a big fan of his work.
Mm-hmm.
But just the fact that you're mentioning where these, say the majority of these is in the sliding, between the layers, that sliding, because that's so fundamental to movement work, to structural integration, myofascial work, massage. I mean, whatever you want, whatever you're doing out there,
mm-hmm.
And that really fascinates me because I think that's what we're affecting the most when we do hands-on work is the sliding layers. And
I would agree.
That's what my mentor taught me. That's what I've come to observe the most in my practice of working with people is that sliding layers. And if I just hypothesize how much that makes sense,
mm-hmm. Sure,
that would be the case because we're constantly sensing where we are in our environment. And it also speaks to, are you familiar with Thomas Hanna, his work with somatics?
Yes, not with depth, but I know that's out there.
Are you familiar with the term sensory motor amnesia that he uses?
Yes, very much so. Very much so. So
my question for you is, in this, you can pure speculation if you want,
Sure. I'm happy to do that.
How does that, is there clinical evidence that you know of that speaks to that, or is that, or if you want to completely speculate on it, where would you come from that point of view?
Yeah. I'm not aware of any clinical studies in depth of sensory motor amnesia. So if anybody listening knows that there are, hey, send it to Isaac. Isaac, send it to me.
Yeah, please do.
But I certainly observe a phenomenon that could be called sensory motor amnesia.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll give you a good example. I was working with somebody just yesterday, a brand new person, and they had a number of things happen to their spine, including fusion because of an accident. This was a very fit, very healthy individual who had been extremely physical for all of his life. So he came in with good material to work with, if you know what I mean.
Sure.
That same thing could happen to somebody who was a desk jockey, and even though the injury and everything that happened could be just the same, what you're dealing with is not the same. Mm-hmm. So in the case of this person yesterday, when I was working, again, along the iliac crest in the region of the obliques and the quadratus lumborum, uh, I was expecting to feel what would be called a densification in the fascia in that area. I did not.
Interesting.
In fact, yes. Now, was there a shortening? Could there have been more space between the bottom of the rib cage and the iliac crest? Sure, but I didn't feel what I expected to feel, and that's always interesting to me because it's like, okay, so what's that really about?
So can you say a little bit what you expected and what you felt?
Yeah, I expected to feel a thickening. I expected to basically not get very far between those two structures with my hand. And when I got as far as I did, I expected that it would feel much more like a tree, as opposed to a bendable, like a Gumby figure. What I felt was neither of those things. And yet I didn't feel any atrophy. And I've certainly worked with people who have had nerve damage, who've had muscle atrophy, and once you felt it, you know what that is when you feel it again.
Sure, absolutely.
But with a little prompting, he was able to actually mobilize and move his from his waist quite well, pulling the hip down and away from the rib cage, doing kind of a hula dancer kind of move. But it took a lot of prompting and concentration on his part to make that movement. So from that, I could hypothesize that the last 5 years of his life had been about keeping that as stable as possible and not moving it. Yet, I guess because he's the physical specimen that he is, he didn't have the kind of densification or atrophy that I might expect in a less athletic person in their mid-40s. So with him, it became more about trying to isolate those areas, what exercises, what he could do to begin to strengthen and get more neurologically in touch with those areas to kind of recover from that sensory motor amnesia. So I went in a completely different direction with him than you might in a typical structural integration session or myofascial release. I also referred him to a colleague of mine that has an amazing machine called the Spine Force, which is really, really good for restoring coordination in these kinds of instances.
So essentially you went from manipulation of fascia and connective tissue to a movement-oriented session. Yeah,
re-education. But part of that, an essential part of that is being able to get them to feel it. So you need to put your hand on it and go there, brings it into the brain in a way that if you're just working with movement, they don't necessarily know how to find that to move it. So I think the combination of the two is potentially more powerful than one or the other.
Absolutely. And that is exactly how I work as well. And that's something I've noticed quite frequently with people that I would term it as the sensory motor amnesia, where they have, and I see it from very fit people to very sedentary people, where they have no concept of how to move in that area. It's almost like it doesn't even exist.
Yeah, and it's almost, I find they get rather embarrassed.
Oh yeah. It's very embarrassing because it feels like you're trying to tap into something that that again, it doesn't exist for them. So it's very confusing and it's frustrating. I was working with a woman last week that with some breathing patterning, and she wasn't able to access a certain breathing pattern that I was asking her to access. And it was very frustrating for her. And she could see that she needed to do it, but she wasn't able to access it. And over the course of the session, she was able to access small amounts of it towards the end, but it's obviously something that she needs to work on, over time, that's going to help shift and change the rest of her body. So it's really neat that you're talking about this. And I'll be 100% transparent here because I'm excited about it, because it it gives me more of a window, I believe, into my own work that I'm personally doing. And
Great.
I will be using your book here for my references in my lecture at the Yagi Symposium.
Great, wonderful. I look forward to your lecture when we're there.
Are you going to be there?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent! Wonderful.
I'm doing a session with Liz Stewart.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exciting. It's gonna be a lot of fun. It's gonna be
I'm really looking forward to getting to know the community again, because I've been kind of absent without leave for a while.
In your practice, in your personal practice, how much are you? I mean, because this took a lot of time to write this book. Right? I mean, how many years did it take?
The actual physical writing started on the 18th of January, and I turned the manuscript in on the 5th of December. I've been thinking about it for years.
Yeah.
I mean, the ideas and the way they're put together, these are things that were tumbling through my brain for probably a decade. But mind you, before I even got to write the book, I had to submit an outline. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that the outline I submitted pretty much adheres to the way the flow of the book is, in terms of what's in the first chapter, what's in the second chapter, what's in the third chapter. So once I had that outline, I knew that gave me the structure that I needed to build the book. But that outline was approved in early June, and I didn't start the writing for almost 6 months later.
June of 16 or 17?
June of 2015.
Oh, 15. Okay.
Yeah. So, and then, the outline gets approved, then this has to happen. Then you have to talk about illustrations, and, there's all these other internal things that go on about, making a book from the publisher standpoint, because it's a business for them and it has to fit a certain model that they have. So I didn't actually physically start writing the book till almost 6 months later, a little over 6 months later. So that gave me more time to continue to mull things over, organize my research. But I had to take a lot of time off during that year. It wasn't like I just did it in the evenings. I actually had to take dedicated time off. There was some weeks I reserved for continuing education that I wound up not taking, because I said, well, I got to finish this chapter, and I'm going to take that week off, and I'm spending that whole week on this chapter, or whatever that piece might have been at the time. So it did take concentrated, dedicated time.
I would imagine it did, and that was what I was going to ask you next. Is that how it affected your practice? I mean, that's a lot of dedication to put into. I know personally, because doing this podcast, doing my app, I have an online course that I'm building. It's I don't have time for anything else.
Yeah, my pay cut took a hit. I definitely took a definite pay cut in the year that I wrote the book, because I took one day away from my practice every week. So it's like, okay, this is a dedicated writing day. Did that always happen? No, because sometimes life gets in the way.
Absolutely.
But again, it was about creating structured time, even, regardless of the results, and maintaining that discipline of having the structured time.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really grateful that you're actually sharing this with me and with the audience, because it's something that I personally struggle with in everything that I'm trying to get done. And also, I'm sure there's many of our colleagues out there as well that are working on projects that they're doing, and maybe, or have ideas in how to get there. Mm-hmm. And this gives a kind of a roadmap of the reality of getting these projects out there, how much you have to sacrifice. So I really appreciate your sacrifice on this.
Thank you.
And your time, because I know
I never thought of it that way, but I suppose it was.
Well, it is. You have to be able to, from a practice management standpoint in our practice, it cuts into your daily income to be able to have to do this, because you're betting on this getting out there and hopefully making some income for that to replace that time that you sacrifice, so to speak, right?
Well, yes, and that replacement income will hopefully happen this year.
I hope so too.
But so far, the sales are very, very positive. So the indicators are all there.
Good.
I will say this though, it changes your brain.
Oh yeah.
I can remember very clearly when I finished the last chapter, which was actually chapter 6. So, just because the book has an order doesn't mean that you write it in the order that it comes in. It's weird, but sometimes it works that. You're stuck on one part, you go and write another part.
Sure.
But I remember when I finished chapter 6 and hit save, and I knew that all the core writing was done, it was like, oh, the sky is blue. Oh, there's birds. I mean, it was just like this phase change happened.
Yeah.
From where I had been till suddenly where I was like, okay, I can actually step away from this now for a while.
Mm-hmm.
That was very, very unexpected.
Yeah, it's constantly looming over your shoulders in the back of your mind too. You know.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, exactly.
Having to take those mental notes of like, oh, I need to reference that in the book, and I need to reference this, and I'll go back and change this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's not, you say looming over your shoulder, that has kind of a menacing quality to it. I think deadlines are good because, as Douglas Adams says, I love the sound deadlines make when they go whooshing by. But I work better with deadlines because it gives me a measurement.
Yeah.
So I sometimes created my own deadlines, like, okay, by this point, I want to have this done, and that just kept me making sure that the project proceeded on a schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise you never finish.
Exactly. Finishing is good.
Yeah.
You're talking here about the Ruffini receptors.
Mm-hmm.
Please, if I'm butchering any of these names, please let me know.
No, you're doing great, man.
And is it Pacini?
Pacini. They're
receptors.
Italian. They're Italian receptors.
I love this. Here in this book, it's on page 79. It says the Pacini receptors respond to sudden, rapid changes in pressure and vibration by increasing both proprioception and motor control. Great. I just love that sentence. Because it gives such a great description of what they're doing. Is there anything you would like to say about the Pacini receptors? And do you love them? Do you? I mean, I really like that quote from your book here.
Yeah. Well, they're definitely one of the more sensitive pressure receptors in the body, and apparently there's a lot of them in your fingertips as well.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Schleich thinks, and I have no reason to disagree with him on this, that probably accounts for a lot of the beneficial effects of chiropractic adjustments because they're abundant in the ligaments of the spine. And what's interesting
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, actually I will. That's one of the places where this specific cell receptor is found quite highly in histological studies, is in the ligaments around the spine, in the soft tissue around the spine. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is there is an obscure practice called naprapathy, which was
with it. Mm-hmm.
offshoot of chiropractic, and that happened in the 1920s. And the founder of naprapathy was a chiropractor and friend of D.D. Palmer, the creator of chiropractic. Mm-hmm. And he started going to the morgue and opening up cadavers and looking for subluxations that were relevant to the cause of death. So, right, okay, that's so fascinating. This person died of liver failure. So let's look at where the liver is innervated from the spine and see if there's a subluxation there. Well, there wasn't. This person died of tuberculosis. Let's look at the innervation areas in the 3, 4, and 5 where the lungs are innervated from, and what have you. And he never found a single subluxation in any of the cadavers that he studied. He did, though, under the microscope, find scarring in the ligaments, soft tissue, and fascia, if you will, around those spinal segments. So he worked towards creating a whole soft tissue manipulation system for the spine that he thought would be better than chiropractic. And, of course, as often happens, rivalry ensued. And his mentor did not care for his ideas. And unfortunately, naprapathy fell into relative obscurity.
Yeah, I actually looked about 15 years ago. I looked into becoming a naprapathic doctor. It's hard to pronounce.
Yeah, I know. How you name things is really important.
It really is. So that's fascinating. You know, like for instance, if you take structural integration, spine work, like a second hour or even first hour, fourth hour,
Yeah,
tracking,
sixth or seventh hour.
sixth or seventh hour, and something that I actually did personally. This was probably about. I started doing this probably around 2005, maybe 2006. Is after I read the book Spinal Manipulation Made Simple by Jeffrey Maitland.
Yep.
And I can't remember if Jan Sultan had anything to do with that book. But
I don't think so, but I'd have to go back.
I know that they worked together for a while. I'm sorry, you need to go?
No. I said I'd have to go look. He said, pointing to his library back there, because I know
that book influenced a lot of my back work and also post 10 work. And I've done a lot of work with degenerative discs, herniated discs, spondylolisthesis, and so forth. That book really helped me understand a lot of different things. So anyways, long story, but
it's a good story.
But now what I've done in recently, I've kind of come up with my own over the last 10 years or so, my own spinal manipulation, but I deal with the ligamentation of the spine. And I work around the spinous process, on top of the spinous process, around the ligamentation of the spine with movement to free up vertebra. And it's amazing how quick and how fast symptoms change, go away, or decrease with that. And it's fascinating to me that you're mentioning the naturopathic work and that the origin of that. I did not know that history.
I was fortunate in the early 90s to study with a chiropractor who also was a naturopath. And he called it spinal syndesmobilization. Again, be careful how you name things. Because that was another weird sounding, obscure mouthful.
Right.
But he was a phenomenally good teacher. And that certainly, having learned his version of naturopathy, certainly informed my approach to, like you said, the second hour, the sixth or seventh hour, depending on what formula you're using, in my SI work, and really, it's richer for it. It's richer for it.
Now, do you tend to work with the ligamentation as well along the spine? I'm just curious, just out of a.
Probably not as specifically as you do, because my first thought was, well, if you turn this into a course, I want to take it, because that would increase my ability that way. The way that it's done in the naturopathic system is really being, again, you're checking relative motion and sensation, and you're looking for sharp pains versus dull pains. And, whether the spine is articulating along the transverse processes or from spinous process to spinous process. And that what you're palpating in terms of motion and what they're telling you in terms of a dull feel versus a sharp feel, there's kind of a formula that you use, and then certain handholds where you just kind of do deep breathing with kind of specific, gentle, I call them insinuations, rather than manipulations, because you're just suggesting that maybe it might be better if they move more in this direction. But it's a conversation between you and the person. You're not trying to force something to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Fun. Just love it. Thank you so much. This is so much fun.
Oh, you're welcome, Isaac. I'm enjoying it too.
Fascia in the brain.
Yeah.
So what for me?
Fascia on the brain, man.
Yeah, man. Fascia on the brain. So the Glia cell that what I like here in your figure on page 94, the figure 5.3, Glia cell sitting in a neural net, looking suspiciously like a fibroblast in a fascial net. I love that.
Thank you.
It was so perfect. Like, so when I saw the photo, I was like, what? Wait, what?
Good. That's exactly what I wanted to have happen.
Oh, you got me. You totally got me on it. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Glia cells and just, just give an overview for our viewers?
Well, early on in my training to do fascial body work, I got introduced to the concept of the glial cells. And it was suggested, or at least I interpreted at the time, is that the glia were the fascia of the brain. And that like lit me up big time. So I started reading and trying to understand as much about glia as possible. And somewhere down the line, I was talking with Robert Schleip, and he said, now, glia are not fascia. And I went,
it's a good impression, by the way.
Like, and I thought, well, thank you, Robert. I know that now. But I had already spent a lot of time just reading up about glia in really being intrigued by it. And that just forced me to dive deeper, because then he asked me to do a presentation on this idea that there's some connection between the glial network and the fascia network. And fortunately, I had like a year to plan for it. So the very much like fascia in the musculoskeletal body, the glia in the neuroscience body, the glia in the brain are more abundant than the neurons, but they were kind of neglected in favor of the neurons because it was just sort of determined. And you mentioned about the history, and I write about the history of neuroscience in the book. There was just this bias towards the neuron because reasons. So what I find fascinating when people start going on about, well, you're not being scientific and you're not using scientific theory and you're not trying to disprove what you believe. Sometimes people just hold on to a belief and develop a whole field out of that because they see something important there. That's how neuroscience started, boys and girls. So, people have their biases, confirmation bias or otherwise. And sometimes a good idea with good evidence behind it, we can run with that for a very long time. But it was almost 100 years before it was discovered that the glia form another connected network within the brain that talk to each other and are capable, in a bit like a sensory nerve way, of signaling other glia throughout the brain. And at least in the story of Albert Einstein and his brain, there may be this idea that how we use our brain, what parts of our brain we use, can change the number of glia in that area of the brain that processes that information. That's what fascinates the heck out of me. So just as if I use my body in a certain way and excite the fibroblasts to build or take away more collagen, I can excite the glia in my brain to create more connections with each other and with the neurons.
So just for our listeners out there, what do glia do? What do they do? I mean, as far as we know.
What don't they do? Well, they're sort of custodians. They're responsible for keeping the immune function in the brain going. They're also kind of guards for the neurons, but they also can determine what signals go from one neuron to another neuron. So they're very involved in how the brain processes. But they do it in a chemical way, not in an electrical way, which was why it took so long to find this out.
Right.
So the function of the brain is electrochemical in nature, but the glia is a big part of that chemical interaction.
Do they have anything to do with neuropeptides?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I'll write that down and I'll get back to you next week.
Next book. Put it in the next book.
Yeah, there we go. Well, hey, second edition, baby.
It's going to come.
But glia are definitely very involved in learning in development of the brain and the physical body. And so in the chapter, I look into some of the possible connections of what might be going on there. And certainly one of the most exciting things that I found was in a medical hypothesis paper. And I have to tell you, I found it the evening before I had to give my lecture on this at the Fascia Summer School in Germany. Yeah, it's that
was a little stressful for you. Just maybe
it was
a little bit.
It's you just never know when or where you're going to find something. But there's a whole train of thought that suggests that what we call muscle memory, and of course with my confirmation bias, I think of it as fascial memory, that muscle memory may actually be a function of the glial network. Yeah, I know.
Sounds
but
like
that gets into a realm of biochemistry that I am not literate in.
It sounds like I really need to learn a lot more about glia, because muscle memory fascinates me, absolutely fascinates me, or fascial memory, I mean, whatever we really want to call it, right? But
well, it's in the references. It's in the references for chapter 5. I can tell you that.
I'll be looking more into it. I just want to cover one more thing. In chapter 7, you're mentioning devices and palpation. Excuse me. Palpation technology, the algometer, Iton Pro, ultrasound. Those are the 3 main ones that you're mentioning here that I can see. Do you use these devices in your practice at all?
I do not, mostly for reasons of time. And expense. So the Myotone Pro, which is a little handheld device that measures tissue density, I've had the opportunity to play with these tools. That's like a $5,000 or $6,000 tool. A good portable ultrasound machine that's like a combination PC and Mac with an ultrasound device, that's about $20,000. So what's cool about the ultrasound is you can image and you can see where things are sliding and where they're not sliding. And then you can do an intervention, re-image them, and suddenly what was stuck is now sliding. And that's very exciting that you can actually in real time say, look, we made a change.
Yes, absolutely.
But it's just, in terms of the cost and the practicality, if I was involved in research, these are tools I would want to use for measurement purposes. But in terms of keeping a good client schedule on a daily basis, it's just not practical yet. Maybe 5 years from now, there'll be an affordable ultrasound machine, and that could actually be of use.
Well, the one that Dr. Stripe's playing with, the Clarius, is around, I think it's around 7,000.
I don't know about that one. I don't know about
it's
that
good.
one.
It's pretty good.
I think in the hospital setting, it would be useful. I work in an integrative medicine center, so I'm attached to a university hospital, and that's where we do acupuncture, chiropractic, EMDR, yoga, different forms of psychotherapy and such. It would be nice to be able to send people out and say, oh, look, the ultrasound said my fascia stuck, so they sent me to you. I mean, I can see it being used diagnostically as a way to get away from pharmacological solutions or from PT-based solutions that were maybe not appropriate for the condition.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's how I see it being used more than like for me in my office.
Yeah. The more identification that we can have for research and for pointing the people in the right direction of whatever therapy they may need based off of those tests, just, the more people can be helped in a more timely fashion.
Absolutely.
Excellent, David. So, thank you for being.
Oh, thank you. This has been a lot of fun. I really have enjoyed talking to you, and I'm just really chuffed at like how you had things highlighted that you wanted to dive deeper into. That was really gratifying, because it's like when I wrote this to excite people. And to see that excitement, it's like, okay, wow, it worked.
Yeah, you definitely got me.
Accomplished.
I'll tell you, when I first saw your book, I'm like, oh, another book on fascia.
But there's not that many books on fascia.
I know, but they're most like just saying like, okay, this is what we think fascia is.
Yeah.
But what you've done here is that you've really put together a great resource for all of us practitioners and people that are just maybe interested and want to know about more about fascia. And
thank you.
Like your title of your book, what is it and why it matters, is great, because again, you dive into the history, you explain what it is, you come from a neutral standpoint of like, this is what we know, and this is what we know is possibly happening. And I really appreciate that perspective, because most of the stuff that's out there is such a generalization of it. And I feel like you've really pieced together a lot of the stuff that I've read and have seen and have thought or maybe experienced, and there's no perfect answer, of course, but I think you're doing a really good job of putting all that together in one place, and I really appreciate your time on it.
Thank you so very much, Isaac. That's music to my ears.
Excellent. So is there any final words that you would like to say to our audience of any advice, or I'm going to put it in the show notes, links to your book so that they can go out there and purchase your book. Hopefully they do. I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
Your clinic that you work at, if you want to put that in there as well, where people can find you, all that information, any of that information, please give it to me so I can put it in the show notes. And final words, advice,
final words,
a joke, whatever you want.
Well, you're opening up the door really wide here, Isaac.
Your impressions are pretty good, David. So you could end with a killer here.
I have to be careful now. Stay curious. That's because that's learning. Learning begins with curiosity, and it's easier to be curious when things aren't quite working according to plan than when they are working according to plan. Every time I have a new situation that walks into my office, it's like, oh, here's an opportunity to try something I haven't tried before. I wonder how it's going to work this time. I wonder what kind of results we're going to get. Now, I'm confident because of my knowledge base and my ability in the ability to make a change, but I'm excited at the new possibility that's sitting before me. And that keeps me curious about what's really going on, and it feeds me wanting to learn more. So stay curious and always connect. So every time you open your mouth and you're talking to the person in front of you who's come to you for help, basically what you say, you're either going to connect with that person or you're going to divide with that person. So always choose to connect. That, I think, is a binary.
Absolutely.
Thank you for watching the Body Align Pro podcast. For more information, visit bodyalignpro.com. You can download the app for free on the Apple App Store. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. Be sure to check out the show notes for links. If you are enjoying this, please be sure to subscribe and share this with your friends and family. Once again, thanks for watching, and see you next time.